everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of Song Theory. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. I'm doing an unedited video today talking about 90s music. Now, the reason why I'm talking about 90s music today, and I've done it before actually, I might, hit you with an iCard somewhere up here with an old video that I made about 90s music and 90s nostalgia. Twitter is trending right now with the subject of 90s nostalgia and remembering the 90s and everything. And a lot of you who are on here don't know much about the 90s because you weren't even born yet. But I was. And I think the crazy part about, just reminiscing about the 90s, and we're going to get specifically into the music soon, is the 90s they're so colorful. It was so colorful, and the clothes were just, man, too big. Clothes are just too big. And I think what's funny is that, pop culture in that time, when you watch people on TV and, like I'm not super old. I'm only 25. I was born in 95, the beginning of 95. And, I remember things like watching the first ever episode of SpongeBob. I remember watching new episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, new episodes of Boy Meets World, you know what I mean? And I think what we have to recognize is that music had a huge, huge part to do with all of that, right? So for me, I was introduced really to the hip hop genre around 98, 99. I was really into it because, around that time, I believe in 96, Tupac had just died. So I didn't know much about all that because I was very young. But by the time I started getting to 4 and 5 and 6 years old, I started getting more into the genres of hip hop, learning more about Nas and Snoop Dogg and Def Jam and all those guys. And I would probably go as far to say that hip hop was really, really heavily influential back in the 90s. It was very, very heavily, there was a lot of protests involved, with the 1993 riots, or was it 92? I think it was 92, 93 riots that happened in LA. You had a lot of police brutality happening even then regarding, Rodney King and stuff like that. So hip hop was very heavily political in the 90s. And I love that genre. I really do love the political hip hop talking about, you have to remember NWA really was, really slammed into the forefront of political hip hop. Because back in the 70s and 80s, hip-hop wasn't necessarily political. It really was just talking about life in the city, life as a, black man just, going around doing his thing. And until the 90s, right around the late 80s, early 90s, after the crack epidemic hit and the war on drugs began, a lot of black men started experiencing more discrimination because of the higher policing within these communities so they can, be at war with the drugs. So the 90s became very heavily political with the hip hop scene, not just with NWA, but also with, Tupac, also with Biggie, and you had other rappers as well, like Nas and, Mos Def and Common, and all these guys were coming out with all of these beats in hip hop. And, you started having groups like, the Wu-Tang Clan coming out, busting out the scene and really just doing all their, some of their greatest hits were in the 90s, right? Because this was the heyday of hardcore political hip hop that really smacked you upside the head and really had you listening to what they had to say. Then, you go on to rock, right? Jesus, 90s rock, man. Like, it's almost impossible not to, think of a Nirvana song. It's almost impossible not to think of a Green Day song. It's almost impossible not to think of a Weezer song. Rock in the 90s was incredible. You have all of these songs that are just hits, just straight up hits, undoubtedly. And when you start to think of it like that, you start to recognize that rock, the genre of rock, has evolved so much. And it's incredible because at this point, you have to recognize rock now is not what it was then. I would say this, at the very least. Hip-hop has evolved to where it is more mainstream. It's not as political, but hip-hop is still the primary genre in the United States. Rock used to be the primary genre. Well, actually, country, we'll get to country in a second. Country used to be the primary genre, and then it shifted to rock around the 60s and 70s when you started introducing people like the Beatles and Kiss and all of these guys like Rolling Stones and AC/DC, all of these, you know, heavily 70s, 80s bands that were doing some heavy rock and crazy hair and makeup and all that stuff. Country music was really what was taking over in this country right before the 60s and way back then. But once you got into the 80s and 90s, hip-hop became the it genre. There was a point where rock was it, but then hip-hop came back into the scene. And even now in 2020, hip-hop is the genre of the United States, really. I mean, it's the most popular genre. So let's talk about country music really quick. Country music has been around and will always be around. Country music, really, a lot of people would say, is the original genre of the United States. I mean, you start having bluegrass country dudes singing in the banjo, ding, ding, all that stuff in the backwoods of Virginia friggin' since the country began. However, the problem with country music is that a lot of its fan base started to drift away for several reasons. One of which is because when you started having more minorities come into this country, they started listening to the genre of country and started feeling more detached from it because it didn't feel like country music was very inclusive for a long time. There has come a point now since probably 2010 where country music has made this entire shift thanks to people like Taylor Swift, who started in the genre of country, but then slowly started to mosey into the genre of pop, which is kind of where country is now. Country music is really poppy now. Not like it was in the 80s and 90s, where it was very, you know, Reba McEntire. You know, you got, I don't know a lot of country artists, so don't sit here and judge me for it. I don't know a whole lot. But you have a lot of country artists who didn't transition very well into the now, right? A great example is Billy Ray Cyrus. He did the song Achy Breaky Heart. I mean, that was back when he had the mullet and everything, right? Okay, we have to recognize, though, when he made that song, okay, it was not, it wasn't a time in country where it was like, oh, you know, it was very centralized. You had a lot of white country people, a lot of black country people in general, who really listened to that genre, but everybody else, the urban areas, the suburban areas, they really weren't listening to country like that. So, of course, a song like Achy Breaky Heart blew up when Billy Ray Cyrus made it. But if Achy Breaky Heart or a song like it were to come out now, the country genre, A, wouldn't really respect it because it's not pop like they want it to be. And B, the people, the culture of America, they're not really going to pay much attention to it. And that's kind of why country has fallen off since the 90s, for example, into now. And I think lastly, if you were to talk about, you know, a genre that really transcended from the 90s to the now is house music. A lot of people don't recognize this, but dubstep, electronic music, all that stuff really came from house music. You know, these guys sitting around the DJ board and coming up with these really, really hot, you know, beats that came from one tone and another tone and another tone and this tone, and that one carried into this tone. And now you have this, you know, really eclectic, really interesting beat that can carry throughout the entire party. And then, of course, you're able to change that into another song. And disc jockeys made this popular back in the 90s or 80s and 90s. Really, it started in the 70s, went into the 80s, and then came into the 90s, where disc jockeys were all, they were the it thing. They were the guys that were transitioning the songs from one vinyl, and then they would transition to put the other vinyl on, and that's how they were doing it. And so a lot of what you guys don't know is that house music, electronic music, dubstep, all that stuff came from what was being done back then. So once again, when you recognize the intense changes that have happened between now, between the 90s and now, you'll see that music has definitely changed. Now, some people will say hip-hop ain't the hip-hop it used to be. It's true. Country ain't the country it used to be. It's true. Rock ain't the rock it used to be. All of that is true. What you have to recognize is that everything must change. Everything must change. Nothing will stay the same. And if it does, it'll die out. If it doesn't evolve with the ears of the people and the ideas of the people, the genre will die. All right? So when you think of it in that way, it makes a lot of sense why a lot of these genres sound so different. They're not going to sound the same like they used to. And that's on purpose. That's the way the world works. And that's the way it is. So I love the fact that this was something I could talk about. I didn't go super deep into it, but I just want to talk about some of the genres and some of the nostalgia from the 90s. I thought it was a fun concept to talk about. And anybody who has some fond memories of the 90s, comment below. Tell me what was your favorite song. What did you like about the, the time period, that decade? Let me know what you think. And then, of course, once again, I thank you all for watching, subscribing, and liking and sharing. I love you guys. Hope you have a great day and about tomorrow. God bless. I'll see you all later.